Hi friends, welcome to this session, and in this video we'll learn about Docker Compose. Till now what we have done is we pulled the Docker images from Docker Hub and also created our own custom Docker images using Dockerfile and then run the containers. The number of containers we were working with were very few, and that's the reason why it was easy to remember all the Docker run commands and their options. But what happens if you are working in a large cluster of application that involves microservices? In such situation, it becomes very difficult to remember all those run commands and their options to create or run the containers. In our previous session, if you noticed, the MySQL container, the Docker run command was very long. So let me show you that. If you see here, the Docker run command, I copied into a separate file, so I can just copy and paste and use this to create the container. And you can see the number of options that we used. So it's easy to miss one or two options here. And in such situations, what happens is we can use Docker Compose to run multiple containers in a single command. So again, where there are multiple containers to run, we can use Docker Compose. Let's go back to the Docker docs and let's try to see the reference to understand Docker Compose. What it says is, Compose is a tool for defining and running multiple container Docker applications. In other words, it is a tool used to define multiple containers and their respective options in a YML file, which later we can use as a single Docker Compose command to run all the containers. Okay, so for now, if you got that, it's well and good. If not, you will better understand when we practically create Compose file and go through each steps. Okay, but for now, just make a note of the definition that it is a tool. So when I say it's a tool, then how do we install it? Then if you see here, we have installation steps. By default, if you are using Mac or Windows and you install Docker Compose also gets installed along with it. Okay, and you can check by going to the command prompt and using the Docker Compose version, and you can see the version of the Docker Compose installed. But if you are using Linux operating system, you might need to follow a couple of steps to install Docker Compose, and you can follow the steps mentioned here. Next is the release notes, and if you see the release note, the version is 1.25.5, and that is what we have installed. Next is getting started. Okay, and it explains you the steps involved to create a Docker Compose. Before we jump into the steps, let's go back to our Docker overview, and as I said that we are using a YML file to define or create the Docker Compose file. Basically, it has three formats. Okay, till date it has three formats, and we can see that by going through the Compose file reference, and you can see that version 3, 2, and 1, these are nothing but the formats. Okay, and for Docker Engine version 19.03.0 and above, the format is 3.8, but that is nothing but your version 3. So the reason why it is important is the very first line in your YML file is going to be the version number. Okay, and if you look at the command prompt, we have Docker version has 19.03.8, which is nothing but 3.8 here. Okay, and hence our version is going to be 3. So let's go back here. Now let's take a look at the steps. The steps involved are basically 3. The number 1 step is related to the image. So you need to have your image, Okay, if you are going to use Docker file to build your image, you can use that. Or if you're trying to pull the image from the Docker Hub, you need to use image as a command in the YML file. Or if it is locally available, even that is okay. That what happens is the Docker Compose will try to search the file from first locally, and if it is not available, it's going to search from the registry. Okay, so that is the step one related to images. The second step is defining all the services. Now, when I say services in Docker Compose world, it is nothing but the container. So you need to configure your container. That is your step two. The step three is run the Docker Compose up command, and that will run the containers that you have configured in the YML file. So let's get started and go through each step. So what I'm going to do is, and through the steps, when we are doing the steps, we'll also look at environment and networking. So let's take an example, a very basic example. I'll go back to the overview of Docker Compose where we have a very simple example here. I'll copy this into a file. And you can see that the very first line is the version. I have changed I'm using Notepad++ and I have changed the language to YML. So it's easy to read. I'll change this to version 3. Okay, because the format that we're going to use is 3. And then the second line is configuring the services. So let's do that. I'll just give an empty line so it becomes easy to read. And as I said that your services are nothing but the containers. So here we are going to take an example of Spring Boot web application and MySQL container, okay, that we saw in our previous session, because Spring web application is dependent on MySQL container, because to successfully start the web application, MySQL containers needs to be up and running. So this becomes a very good example to demo Docker Compose. So I'll name it as Spring Web Container. And build is nothing but if you have a Docker file and you want to build the image using that Docker file. But if you go back to our list of images, you can see that from previous session, we already created an Spring Web container, or sorry, image, okay, which is available locally. So instead of using a Docker file, now we can make use of this. So how to do that? We are going to do is, instead of build, we are going to use image. Okay, and let me name this to as our MySQL container. Okay, so I have two services, Spring Web Container and MySQL Container. I have image, and the image name is, okay, let's go back to this, and I copied it and I'll paste it here. And the version is, and the tag is latest. Perfect. Next is the ports, and this being a web application, the port is 8080 to the external world, and within the container, I'm publishing it as 8080. I'm not using any volume, so I'll just remove this. And you can see that volumes being an array is defined as a dash, and you can see that ports, a container can have multiple ports exposed, and that's how you can see here it is defined as ports and a dash. So you can have multiple ports defined here. So I don't have any volume, so I'll just remove this. And links is basically nothing but it shows the dependency of one container to the other, or you can say one services to another. If you look at the networking, it has the details of links, where it says links allow you to define extra aliases by which a service is reachable from another service. Okay, so that's how it is saying that it is MySQL container. I have to rename it. Okay, so it's MySQL container, this is nothing but the name of the service that it is trying to reach. And that's all we have for the Spring Web container. We have the image, the ports, and the links. That's it. The next is the MySQL container. And remember, we have lots of options to define for the MySQL container. So let's go to our Docker run command, copy this, and put it over here just for the reference to make sure that we have all the options covered. Okay, the name of the service, we already gave that. Then we don't need the detach. Then we have the environment variable. So in Compos, we do have an option that says environment. Okay, and this is basically nothing but again an array. Okay, array of all this. So let's copy this and paste it here. And the same way I'll copy the rest. Okay, so we have all our environment set up. Now the next is the ports. So ports hyphen, and this is what I'm going to give. Copy this, put it over here. Perfect. The next is the volume. Okay, so it's going to be volumes because you can have multiple volumes configured in a container. So let me just clean this up here. So we are good till here. And we have volumes. So let's copy this. Okay, so next is our network. And again, a container can have multiple networks. So I'm going to do here networks. And the network that we are going to use is, this is something that we created. So it's going to be Docker network and the MySQL image. And let's see here, the name of MySQL image is nothing but this. So let's copy this and put it over here. And the tag is latest. So with that, I guess we are good with this. We'll just remove this. And again, we don't need a separate volumes, because if you have the same volume referenced in multiple containers, you can just define it at one place and then use it. Okay, so if you assume that you have multiple volumes being configured with the same path, what you can do is you can create a reference to that and use the same reference in multiple places where it has volumes. Okay, so we don't have in this example, so I'll remove this. But I do have one thing, that when I'm creating the container, when I'm running the container, Spring Web container, the network that is going to use is Docker network, because for container to container communication, they both need to be in the same network, right? So let's add network here. And it's going to be Docker network. And again, we have the same network defined multiple places. What you can also do is, you can put it over here, networks, and define it here, saying that as Docker network. And we don't have a separate configuration for this. If you look at the Docker, networking again, if you see here, if we scroll down, and you can see here networks. Okay, and we have same backend, front end. This is how you define networks. Okay, and if the same thing, if you see that the driver is a custom configured driver, then you can define it here and make use of it. Instead of having it multiple places, you can define it one place, that the configuration, the custom driver configuration, and then use that in multiple services. So here we don't have any custom driver that we created. We just created a network, and by default it is bridge driver. So for that, we don't need to specify anything here, just leave it empty. And now let's save this. Let's just review one more time if everything looks good. We have image, ports, links, networks, looks good. Okay, and we have environment, ports, volumes. Okay, let's save this, and I'll go back to a Docker file here, and I'll say it as docker compos.yml. and I'll save this. Okay, so let's go to our, so that completes our step 2, and the third step is to run the docker compose command. So before that, let's see if we have any container running. So there are no running. If there are any stopped, there is none. So there are no containers either in running nor or in stop state. So now we are also in the same folder as our YML file. So the command is docker compose up. If you look at the command here, what it's using is where it is here, getting started. If you scroll down the step, what it says is here, docker compose up. Okay, and that's what we are going to do. It also has dot, so let's add that dot, and let's hit enter and see. Okay, it says there is an error. Okay, it says line number 24. So let's go here, and what it says basically, it says while scanning a double quoted scalar. Okay, so we have a double quote. Okay, so it's not liking this. So let's change this. Now let's see, to single quotes. We change it to single quotes. Now what happens? Okay, it says line 15 while parsing a block mapping in line 15, and it still says 24 has an error. Okay, line 24, let's do this. If this looks good, okay, it still has an error. Okay, I had to pause this video and I tried to see what the issue was, and actually what the problem that we are having here is the double quotes. Okay, and if you see here, it says line number 24, the column 23, which is nothing but our double quotes. So actually it is not able to parse this because we need to give it to the complete volume here. So now let's save this, and let's go back here, and let's try to run this, and it says, okay, did I miss something here? Okay, here, correct, it should be this. Now I think it should be all good. Okay, now search service dot. Okay, that's something that that should not be a dot. Okay, it automatically looks for the YML file in the same folder, so we don't need to do that. We don't need to add the dot. Now let's see. Okay, perfect. So now it is running the containers. The very first container is trying to do is bring container 1. Okay, so the application is starting. Let's see. Perfect, and you can see that it says Docker container, Docker web application started, and also Tomcat started on port number 8080. Okay, and by default you can see that the command is running in foreground. Okay, and so that's the reason why you cannot come out of this. Now let's, before we come out of this, okay, let's try to run the application and try to access the application. Go to localhost 8080 because that is what we mapped onto, and let's see. Perfect, and you can see that we are able to access the application, and the application can connect to the MySQL database and pulls all the user information. And in the database we have just one user named John. So that's how we run multiple containers using Docker Compose. Now we'll try to perform few more options with the Docker Compose command here, and you can see that the application or the Docker Compose is running in foreground. So how do we run this in detached form? So once you come out of this by using Control C, what it does is, you can see it will stop the container. Okay, so if you look at the Docker container ls a, and you can see that two containers were created. One is MySQL and Spring Web container. Okay, so to run this in detached mode, just do this and use the detach option. Now let's run this and see. And you can see that this time it run in detached mode. It says starting container. The name of the container is, that is by it takes the options from the Docker Compose and adds a Docker Compose name here, defined name here. So we don't need to worry about this, but you can see the services are up and running. Let's go back to our browser and refresh and see if the application is accessible. Yes, it is still. Let's check the container status, Docker container LSA, and you can see that both the containers are up and running. Okay, so how do we stop the Docker Compose, or we can say how to stop these containers? Okay, so what we can do is you can use Docker Compose, and you guessed it right, this time the option would be down. So if you hit enter, so it says stopping container 1 and container 2, so both. And you can see that not just stopping, but it also removes the container. Okay, so if you say Docker container LSA, and you can see there are no containers in stop or running status. Okay, so now again, if you run it, okay, here in detach mode, network, okay, it's using network with default driver. Perfect. Now what we can do is, if we list it again, it is up and running, it's all good. Now what I'll do is I'll try to stop the web application. Okay, let's try to stop the web application container using stop command and BC, because that is a container ID here. I'll use BC and hit enter. Okay, so now let's check the status, and you can see that the container is in exited status. Now what happens if I rerun the Docker Compose command, that is up command? So let's do that. If I hit enter, and now you can see that the Docker SQL container, MySQL container, did not start because it is already up. The status is running, so it did not do anything. But the container which was in stopped status or exited status, it started the container. See? So that's how the Docker Compose runs the container. Okay, it just runs only those containers which has status exited. So I hope now you are familiar with Docker Compose and what Docker Compose is and when to use Docker Compose. So Docker Compose, remember one thing, Docker Compose can be used when you have multiple containers to run. Okay, so it becomes easy to remember, or easy to handle all those long Docker run commands. That's all for this video, and I will see you in the next session.